Hi, everyone. We're Mimicker, here to introduce all kinds of knowledge, even the stuff we didn't know about.
And we have a really intense one for you today.
Yeah, we really do. So let me paint a vivid picture for you, our listener. Imagine it's late February 2026. A massive military operation, which gets dubbed Operation Epic Fury, launches. And practically overnight, the Strait of Hormuz is completely blocked.
Completely shut down.
Right. And for those of you visualizing a map right now, we aren't talking about some expansive open ocean. We are talking about a 29-mile-wide choke point.
Which is incredibly narrow in maritime terms.
Exactly. I mean, you could almost run a marathon across it. It's widely recognized as the world's jugular. And suddenly, due to this highly coordinated deployment of naval mines and relentless drone threats, commercial navigation simply ceases to
It
exist.
just vanishes.
Yeah.
Because the physical reality of that closure is, frankly, staggering. When a waterway that narrow is seeded with mines, maritime insurance premiums essentially go to infinity.
Right. Nobody's underwriting that risk.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Shipping companies will not risk $100 million vessels, let alone the lives of their crews. So the physical flow of the modern industrial world just stops in its tracks.
And the mission of our exploration today on I Know You Don't Know is to show you exactly how a geopolitical conflict halfway across the world instantly dictates the price of your groceries, the fabric of your clothes, and even the survival of your favorite AI tools. We're going to dive into the source material to examine these supply chain mechanics.
But before we delve into those mechanics, I do need to make a really vital distinction for our listeners.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
The sources we are analyzing today cover some highly politically charged events involving the United States, Israel, Iran, and the Houthis. We are absolutely not taking any political sides here.
Nope, not at all.
Our sole focus is to impartially report the factual, economic, and supply chain information contained in the sources. We are looking strictly at the logistical math, the physical bottlenecks, and the macroeconomic reactions.
Just the facts and the data. So let's jump into the physical scale first, because I always thought of the Strait of Hormuz as a vulnerable spot. But reading through these sources, I realized my mental model was totally flawed.
How so?
Well, I pictured it as a detour, oh, just go around. But it's not just a detour. The setup in this 2026 scenario is a dual blockade. Simultaneously, we have Houthi attacks escalating in the Bab el-Mandeb region.
Right, the southern gateway to the Suez Canal.
Yeah, so instead of a road closure where you can just, take the next exit, it's more like a single-lane toll booth for a 10-lane mega highway, and someone just poured concrete over the toll booth and the only alternate route.
That is a great way to visualize it.
Mm-hmm.
It's a double heart attack for global logistics. When we look at the data we collect from the energy sector, the numbers are just sobering.
I mean, they're massive.
They really are. This dual chokehold traps 20 million barrels of oil per day. To put that in perspective, that represents 20% of total global daily consumption.
20%, just stuck.
Stuck. Furthermore, it paralyzes 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas, or LNG. The International Energy Agency actually hasn't minced words about this. They officially categorize it as the most severe oil supply disruption in recorded history.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. And the immediate market reaction saw Brent crude spike past $110 a barrel. And predictive models indicate a surge to the $150 to $200 range if that logistical knot isn't untied quickly.
Now, I pushed back on this when I first read it because my immediate thought was we have massive overland pipelines in the Middle East, right?
A lot of people think that.
Yeah, if the ships can't sail out of the Persian Gulf, why can't Saudi Arabia and the UAE just pump the oil across the peninsula to the Red Sea or the Arabian Sea and just load the tankers there?
It's a logical question, but it comes down to the physics of fluid dynamics and infrastructure limits.
Yeah.
Pipelines are rated for specific maximum pressures and volumes.
No, so you can't just crank the dial up?
Exactly. You cannot simply force 20 million barrels of heavy liquid through a pipe designed for a quarter of that capacity without rupturing the steel.
That would be a disaster.
Right. The existing bypass pipelines traversing Saudi Arabia and the UAE have a maximum operational throughput of somewhere between 2.6 and 5.5 million barrels a day.
Okay, so even if they run those pipes at absolute maximum pressure, like redlining the entire system, you're still left with an 18 million barrel daily deficit.
Yes.
That oil physically cannot leave the region.
The bottleneck is absolute.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the secondary consequences. Because petroleum isn't just, combustion fuel for your car. It is the fundamental building block of the physical goods economy.
Which brings us to where you and I actually feel this. Because the very first place this crisis manifests isn't necessarily at the gas pump, it's in the supermarket and the shopping mall.
The invisible tax?
Yeah, let's talk about the logistics tax first. When diesel prices spike, the cost to operate an 18-wheeler jumps overnight. And that cost is immediately baked into the retail price of every apple, every television, and every pair of shoes transported by truck.
Well, the transport cost is significant. The more systemic threat lies in agricultural production itself.
Right, the fertilizer issue.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This is where we have to look at the Haber-Bosch process. Modern agriculture is entirely dependent on synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. To pull inert nitrogen out of the atmosphere and turn it into a usable form for plants, you need a massive amount of hydrogen.
And where does that hydrogen come from?
That hydrogen is overwhelmingly derived from natural gas. Furthermore, the immense heat and pressure required to facilitate that chemical reaction are generated by burning natural gas.
Wow, so natural gas is simultaneously the fuel powering the factory and the raw physical ingredient inside the product.
It is a dual dependency. Consequently, when the Middle Eastern LNG supply was paralyzed, the data we collect reveals that fertilizer prices spiked 30% in a single week.
30% in a week.
Yes, and the timing was catastrophic, aligning perfectly with the Northern Hemisphere's spring planting season.
So the farmers are just stuck.
They operate on tight margins. When fertilizer costs surge by 30%, they simply apply less of it to their fields, which means crop yields plummet.
That's terrifying.
It is. Agricultural economists are raising severe alarms that this specific mechanical failure in the gas fertilizer pipeline could induce widespread famine in the global south. Those economies just lack the buffer to absorb sudden food cost inflation.
That is an incredibly grim reality. But the petrochemical cascade doesn't even stop at agriculture. Let's look at the physical packaging of our world, like the plastic wrapping the food, the synthetic fibers in the clothes we wear.
Right.
The sources highlight Taiwan's Formosa Petrochemical Corporation, or FPCC, as a prime example of this vulnerability.
FPCC operates massive naphtha crackers. These are facilities that take raw naphtha, which is a liquid hydrocarbon mixture derived directly from crude oil, and they crack the complex molecules under intense heat into simpler monomers.
And they rely heavily on the Middle East, right?
Heavily. FPCC relies on the Middle East for 80% of its raw oil and naphtha. Within days of the blockade, FPCC was forced to declare force majeure.
Force majeure. That's the legal, we literally can't do this button, right?
It's a legal declaration stating that unforeseeable circumstances have made it physically impossible to fulfill their commercial contracts.
I found the downstream ripple effects of that single factory shutting down to be mind-blowing. The data we collect shows butadiene jumping 36.7% in a matter of days.
Yes.
For our listeners, butadiene is the core synthetic rubber used to manufacture automotive tires. If you can't make tires, you can't build cars.
And you can't maintain the trucking fleets we just talked about.
Exactly. Meanwhile, ethylene and propylene, which are the foundational polymers for everything from like plastic water bottles to polyester shirts and medical equipment, those jumped over 20%.
The war premium is woven into the very fabric of the physical economy before a single missile even hits a factory.
Wait, so you're telling me that before I even notice the price at the gas pump, I'm already paying a war premium on the plastic wrapping my groceries and the polyester shirt I'm wearing?
Unfortunately, yes. It perfectly illustrates how hyper-optimized globalized supply chains lack the slack to absorb regional shocks. But perhaps the most counterintuitive casualty of this physical blockade is the digital realm.
Oh, this is the part of the deep dive that absolutely hooked me, because I always pictured the cloud and artificial intelligence as these weightless, magical entities, you know? They exist in servers, they're software.
That's the illusion of the digital age.
Right. But the reality is that the digital world is essentially a collection of giant, energy-hungry space heaters that require very specific, highly rare chemical elements from conflict zones just to keep from melting down.
The physical footprint of artificial intelligence is massive. Let us examine the manufacturing of the hardware itself. Advanced AI relies on 5-nanometer and 3-nanometer semiconductor chips. Fabricating chips at the atomic level generates immense heat, requiring cooling environments that are absolutely pristine.
And they use helium for that, right?
Yes, helium is utilized because it has extraordinary thermal conductivity and is completely chemically inert, meaning it won't react with the delicate silicon wafers.
And as I understand from the sources, Qatar supplies roughly 1/3 of the global helium market.
They do. It is a byproduct of their natural gas extraction. When the LNG stops flowing, the helium stops flowing. You cannot manufacture an NVIDIA AI chip without it.
That's crazy.
Furthermore, the chemical bromine is essential for the wet etching process of these semiconductors, and it is the primary ingredient in the flame retardants used to coat the server racks in AI data centers.
And where does bromine come from?
The primary global source for high-grade bromine is the Dead Sea, bordering Israel and Jordan.
So we are looking at an industry that needs helium from Qatar to cool the manufacturing process, bromine from the Israel-Jordan border to etch the chips and prevent the servers from catching fire.
And massive amounts of cheap electricity to power the data centers once they are built.
Right. With the logistics corridors surrounding all those regions paralyzed, the AI boom is effectively starved of its physical nutrients.
The compounding pressures are severe. The data we collect indicates that these material shortages, combined with the surging electricity costs driven by the natural gas deficit, are forcing major technology firms to severely delay their AI infrastructure rollouts.
They just can't build them.
The servers simply cannot be built or powered at projected costs.
Which leads us to the geographic epicenter of this specific technological crisis. Because if advanced chips are bottlenecked by power and gas, this blockade represents an existential threat to the manufacturing hub of the world, Taiwan.
Taiwan's structural vulnerability is profound. The island imports 99.9% of its oil.
Basically all of it.
Yes. More critically, for this specific scenario,
Yep.
liquefied natural gas constitutes roughly 50% of Taiwan's entire power generation grid.
Now, when I saw the reserve numbers in the sources, I had to read them twice. Japan and South Korea maintain months of strategic LNG reserves.
They do.
Taiwan only has an 11-day safety reserve. 11 days. I want to pause and ask you, the listener, to ponder this. The entire global tech economy, everything from your smartphone to advanced military targeting systems, hinges on an island running on what is essentially an 11-day battery pack of natural gas. Why is their reserve capacity so dangerously low?
Well, it is a matter of geographic and physical constraints. Storing LNG is not like storing crude oil in a metal drum. The gas must be cooled to minus 162 degrees Celsius.
Oh, wow.
Right, which requires massive, highly specialized, continuous refrigeration cryogenic tanks. Taiwan is a densely populated mountainous island with high seismic activity and very limited coastal real estate suitable for such massive hazardous infrastructure.
So they just literally don't have the space.
They simply haven't been able to build the physical footprint required to hold more than 11 days worth of fuel.
So if this blockade drags into the peak summer months when civilian air conditioning usage skyrockets, the grid is going to buckle.
It is almost a mathematical certainty.
And sitting right in the middle of that grid is TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, which alone consumes roughly 10% of the island's entire power output.
The government is facing a draconian calculation. Do they implement rolling blackouts in civilian sectors, letting millions of citizens swelter in the tropical summer heat? Or do they force TSMC to throttle production, essentially freezing the silicon shield that makes Taiwan indispensable to the global economy?
The interventions outlined in the sources show a government in absolute triage mode. They are absorbing roughly 60% of the imported oil price hikes directly onto the state balance sheet to shield the public from immediate shock.
Yes, and they've slashed taxes on OPG by 50% to try and hold off rampant inflation.
It's even forcing them to reopen fiercely controversial political debates about restarting Nuclear Plant 3, simply because the threat of total grid failure overrides previous environmental mandates.
It is a textbook example of geopolitical stress overriding domestic policy. And while the physical supply chains are buckling, we must also examine how global capital markets are processing this trauma.
Right. Where does the money hide when the world's jugular is cut? I want to really dig into the macroeconomic mechanics here, specifically the concept of stagflation, because it seems like the ultimate no-win scenario for central banks.
Stagflation is the absolute nightmare scenario for macroeconomic policy. Under normal circumstances, inflation is caused by an overheated economy, too much demand, chasing too few goods.
Right.
A central bank, like the U.S. Federal Reserve, responds by raising interest rates to cool down borrowing and spending. Conversely, if the economy is stagnant, they lower rates to stimulate growth.
But in this 2026 scenario, the inflation isn't coming from people having too much money. It's coming from an absolute scarcity of physical energy.
Exactly.
The cost to power a factory has tripled, so the cost of the goods triples.
Precisely the mechanism. The supply shock halts economic growth, factories idle, ships sit at anchor creating stagnation. But the soaring energy costs drive massive inflation across every sector. The Federal Reserve is trapped.
They can't do anything.
If they lower rates to stimulate the stagnant economy, they pour cheap money onto the inflation fire. If they raise rates to crush inflation, they bankrupt the very companies struggling to survive the supply chain disruptions.
You lose.
The data we collect shows the Fed paralyzing their policy, holding rates firmly between 3.15 and 3.75%.
And while the Fed is frozen, global panic sets in. Investors dump risky assets and flee to the deepest, most liquid safe haven on Earth, the U.S. dollar. The sources note the U.S. dollar index, the DXY, surging to 99.42.
That dollar strength acts as a vacuum. It pulls capital out of emerging markets and exacerbates the debt crisis for developing nations who must buy oil priced in those increasingly expensive dollars. However, amidst this broad market suffering, capital rapidly identified new profit centers.
The defense supercycle. This blew my mind.
It's a massive shift.
The nature of this specific conflict, characterized by relentless, cheap drone swarms and ballistic missile barrages, fundamentally changed military procurement. Companies like Lockheed Martin and RTX hit absolute record highs because nations worldwide realized their airspace was highly vulnerable.
Right.
The order backlogs for advanced interceptor systems like Teshti and Patriot missiles stretched into the next decade.
Capital flows toward necessity. We saw a similar dynamic in global logistics. With the Red Sea and the Strait of Hormuz deemed uninsurable, the global shipping fleet was forced to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa.
And the mechanics of that reroute are fascinating. If you look at a shipping company like Yang Ming, their stock boomed during this crisis. At first glance, you'd think longer, more dangerous routes would hurt shipping companies.
You'd assume so.
But because a voyage around Africa adds 10 to 14 days in each direction, a single vessel is tied up for an extra month per round trip. That effectively removes a massive percentage of active ships from the available global fleet.
The scarcity drives the price.
Exactly. When capacity drops that sharply, freight rates don't just increase proportionally, they skyrocket exponentially as desperate companies bid against each other for the remaining cargo space.
Yeah, the physics of the shipping lane dictate the economics of the freight rate. But perhaps the most intellectually compelling market test during this crisis was the battle of the safe haven assets.
Oh, yes.
The traditional refuge of gold versus the modern challenger, Bitcoin.
The ultimate stress test for the digital gold narrative. Now, the sources show a wild roller coaster. When the war first broke out and the blockade was announced, Bitcoin actually tanked, dropping to around $63,000.
It did.
It traded exactly like a highly leveraged, risky tech stock. But then it violently reversed and rebounded to over $73,000.
The volatility revealed the dual nature of the asset. The initial drop was a liquidity shock. As the U.S. dollar surged and panic set in, highly leveraged investors were margin called and forced to sell their most liquid assets, including Bitcoin, to cover their debts.
They just needed cash immediately.
Yep. Exactly. But the subsequent rebound demonstrated its utility as a censorship-resistant asset.
Right. I'm looking at this and thinking, okay, Bitcoin proved it can operate outside the traditional banking system. When physical shipping lanes are mined and swift banking rails look vulnerable to geopolitical weaponization, a decentralized ledger is incredibly attractive.
It has clear utility.
But I have to push back on the idea that this was a total victory for crypto. Even at $73,000, it still ultimately bowed to the gravity of U.S. dollar liquidity.
That is true.
If the DXY goes high enough, the dollar acts as a black hole that pulls capital out of everything, regardless of how decentralized it is.
That is a highly astute observation. Bitcoin demonstrated resilience and unique utility, but it did not decouple from the broader macroeconomic realities of global dollar liquidity. It is a maturing asset class, but it is not immune to a global credit contraction.
Zooming out from the immediate market chaos, it becomes clear that a shock of this magnitude permanently rewires how nations operate. The 2026 blockade essentially marks the death knell for the era of just-in-time efficiency.
For the past 4 decades, the global economy was optimized for cost reduction. Corporations minimized inventory, relying on cheap, perfectly timed ocean freight to deliver components exactly when needed.
Keep warehouses empty, keep costs down.
Precisely. This crisis proved that optimization is incredibly fragile. The paradigm is forcefully shifting to a just-in-case model, prioritizing resilience and redundancy over pure cost efficiency.
To quantify this shift, the sources introduce a fascinating new macroeconomic metric, the Global Vulnerability Index.
It's a very telling metric.
The math is simple but brutal. You take a country's dependency on the Strait of Hormuz for its energy imports, and you divide it by its domestic renewable energy share.
It perfectly isolates a nation's geopolitical exposure. Relying on imported fossil fuels is no longer simply an environmental debate regarding carbon emissions. It is now widely recognized as a critical national security flaw.
A glaring weakness.
If your industrial base requires foreign oil that must be routed through a 29-mile-wide choke point controlled by hostile actors, you are strategically vulnerable to systemic economic collapse.
No, I struggled with this initially. I thought, if the ships are stuck today and factories are shutting down right now, how does passing a bill to build a wind turbine tomorrow fix the immediate global vulnerability index?
Well, it doesn't solve the immediate crisis.
Right.
It does not solve the acute shortage, but it drives the permanent reallocation of future capital. Asian countries, particularly those heavily industrialized energy-importing nations that bore the brunt of the shock, are accelerating what the sources refer to as electrotech at an unprecedented scale.
We're talking solar panels, offshore wind farms, electric vehicle infrastructure, industrial heat pumps.
Correct. The data we collect suggests that by aggressively deploying these electrotech solutions, these nations project they can reduce their reliance on imported fossil fuels by up to 70% within the next decade.
That is a massive pivot.
The primary motivator is no longer solely climate change. It is state survival. They are attempting to permanently escape the threat of geopolitical extortion.
So, synthesizing all of this, the grand transition we are witnessing is a move from renting energy from a volatile, distant region to literally owning it locally through manufactured technology.
Renting versus owning. Exactly.
Once you build a solar field or a wind turbine on your own sovereign soil, no foreign adversary can deploy naval mines to blockade the sun or the wind. It fundamentally alters the power dynamics of the 21st century.
The traumatic realization of their own fragility has forced a systemic, irreversible adaptation.
That brings me right back to our opening thought. We started by exploring how this blockade acted as a massive double heart attack to the global economy.
The ultimate stress test.
You know, when a patient survives a severe cardiac event, they don't usually celebrate by going back to a diet of fast food. They change their habits. They start exercising. They overhaul their lifestyle, because they are acutely aware that their body cannot survive a second attack.
The trauma forces the change.
So I want to leave you, our listener, with a final thought to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive into the sources. What if the ultimate legacy of the 2026 U.S.-Iran conflict isn't the temporary triumph of fossil fuel leverage or even the immediate chaos of the naval blockade itself?
It's a fascinating question.
What if this immense, agonizing economic pain is the exact catalyst required to make the industrialized world abandon those fuels forever, pushing the reality of peak oil closer than any environmental model ever predicted? Sometimes it takes staring right over the edge of the abyss to finally find the motivation to build a bridge to somewhere else.
Well said.
Thanks for tuning into this episode. If you enjoyed our content, don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and turn on the notification bell.